Polycentric legal order. Here are my sources. Professor Randy Barnett says that every society faces what are called the incentive problem. That is, some people perceive that they are made better off by violating someone else's rights. For example, someone perceives that they could benefit themselves by stealing other people's property. How do we correct this perception? Well, Professor Barnett believes that the only way to do this is to use force. That is, force in terms of self-defense and force in terms of restitution, making the violator give back the property plus damages. The use of force may solve the incentive problem, but it creates problems of its own, problems of power. The problems of power come in two forms: enforcement error and enforcement abuse. Enforcement error is when those in charge of enforcement make an honest mistake. They believe someone who in fact is actually innocent to be guilty, and they punish this innocent person out of this mistaken belief. The problem of enforcement abuse occurs when those who are tasked with enforcing rights actually end up abusing that privilege and use it to benefit themselves at the expense of others. In order to correct the problems of enforcement abuse and enforcement error, most people believe in what Professor Barnett calls the single power principle. The single power principle says that within any given territory, there must be a single power, a monopoly, which has the sole right to authorize the use of physical force. This institution is called a state. If implemented correctly, it is possible that this single power principle might actually solve the problems of enforcement error and enforcement abuse on the part of the non-state actors in society. However, it also creates severe problems with the state actors of society, how to restrain them from enforcement error and enforcement abuse. In particular, the professor identifies 5 problems with the single power principle. The selection problem says, well, who is going to get this extra power? How do we select them? The capture problem says, how do we keep bad people from getting this power? How do we keep this out of the hands of those who would want to violate the rights of others? The corruption problem refers to the fact that once somebody, even if they start off with good intentions, gets power, that person oftentimes is corrupted by that power and becomes someone different. The saying from Lord Acton comes to mind: power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The legitimacy problem Professor Barnett sees as the greatest of them all. The legitimacy problem is when a group of people believe so much in the single power principle that they tolerate all kinds of abuses in its name. If they believe that a state is absolutely necessary, even necessary for their very survival and existence, they will tolerate all kinds of abuses, give all kinds of special legitimacy to the state, which gives the state exceeding powers to violate other people's rights. Finally, there's a conceptual problem. That is, in the single power principle, some people are alleged to have special rights that others do not have. The single power principle gives some people the right to use force when the bulk of the population does not. So typically how this works is the single power is allowed to confiscate its income by force apart from the consent of the people. This is referred to as taxation. The founders of the United States were aware of problems with the single power principle, so they proposed some checks on it. One of the checks is elections and voting. That is, it is an attempt to establish reciprocity, some way that the people can throw out bad rulers. Unfortunately, this check has proven to be woefully inadequate due to people having not the knowledge nor the incentive to vote properly, and also due to the fact that people can vote themselves benefits if they are willing to violate the rights of others. Federalism and the separation of powers is another check on the single power. For example, in the United States, we have within the same government different branches of government that are supposedly to check one another. However, unfortunately, as game theory tells us, when there are a number of people who play over and over and over again the same game, they tend to cooperate. And what might have been an adversarial role turns into a I scratch your back, you scratch my back. And indeed, we see that if everyone has each other by the throat, no one wants to squeeze for fear that he himself will be squeezed. Another check is the right to exit. This is extremely powerful. If somebody doesn't like the jurisdiction, they can move to another one. However, it is extremely costly to exercise. They have to give up so much. They might have to give up their job and close relationships with their friends, and even they might have to adopt another language depending on how far away they go. Professor Barnett's proposed amendments are, first of all, the non-confiscation principle. That is, written in the Constitution, it should say law enforcement and adjudicative agencies should not confiscate their income by force. This is freedom from contract, the right to say no when somebody offers you a contract that you don't think is a good deal. This is something that provides a sense of discipline to the marketplace. This is something that ensures consumers are looked out for, that businesses look for consumer demand, and this is a widely accepted principle outside of government. The competition principle says that law enforcement and adjudicative agencies should not shut down their competition by force. This is freedom to contract, freedom to go to wherever you think is the best deal. The result would be a polycentric legal order, providing genuine reciprocity, checks, and balances in his view. It solves the problems that were associated with a single power principle. The selection problem is solved because people are free to select whoever they want to be their law enforcement and adjudicative agents. The capture problem is solved because if one agency ends up becoming abusive, people can go to another agency for protection. The corruption problem, similarly, you could go to another agency for protection. The legitimacy problem is solved as well because unlike a statist system where a judge's ruling is considered legitimate by virtue of the judge's position in the state, here in a polycentric legal order, the judge's ruling carries only as much legitimacy and authority as his reputation warrants in the community. If somebody was to go to his brother-in-law to get a decision in his favor, nobody would take that decision seriously. The conceptual problem is also solved because in a polycentric legal order, we can have everybody with the same rights. It's not going to be the case that some people have special rights and special powers to make and enforce and impose rules on everyone else. This is not something that is just theory. This is something that has historical precedence to a large extent. For example, in the courts, Professor John Hasnas says, quote, "Tax-supported courts of general jurisdiction are an entirely modern phenomenon. Anglo-American law evolved in the context of a richly diverse set of competing jurisdictions. The royal courts, once they were developed, existed in parallel with the antecedently extant hundred, shire, manorial, urban, ecclesiastical, and mercantile courts. As for the police, quote, the New York City police force was not created until 1845. The Boston Police Department, which describes itself as, quote, the first paid professional public safety department in the country, end quote, traces its history back only to 1838.